Welcome to today's webinar, Pro-Palestinian Activism, the Road Ahead Amid Political Upheaval. This conversation is both timely and essential in an America where advocating for Palestine can bring suppression, threats to free speech, and even punishment. Many of us share a deep concern and a deeper resolve. I'm Roxanne Bruno, a board member for the Community Alliance for Peace and Justice, which is an advocacy group dedicated to shifting U.S. domestic and foreign policy toward greater justice for Palestine and Pakistan. We're thrilled to host this event today along with our co-sponsors, the Center for Nonviolent Solutions, Massachusetts Peace Action, and the Sojourner Truth School for Social Leadership. Their partnership amplifies our collective voice, and we are so grateful for their support because together we are stronger. Before introducing our incredible co-host and panelists, let me outline our 90-minute format. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing again. For the first 40 to 45 minutes, my co-host and I will pose prepared questions to our panelists. We will then move to about 40 minutes of audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions at any time. They will be addressed during the Q&A portion of the program as time permits. And then we'll wrap up with a brief conclusion. I'd like to introduce you now to my co-host, Claire Schaefer-Duffy, who is the program director for the Center for Nonviolent Solutions, and who, as a freelance journalist, has twice traveled to the occupied territories. Thank you, Claire. And now our incredible panelists. Huwaida Araf is a Palestinian-American attorney and human rights activist who has led legal and grassroots initiatives for Palestinian rights for over 2 decades. She previously co-founded the International Solidarity Movement, a Palestinian-led, non-violent resistance movement, which has twice been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Huwaida is the former chairperson of the Free Gaza Movement and was one of the primary organizers of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla. Huwaida currently practices civil rights law in the Detroit area, advocating for people who have been abused by the system, including victims of the Flint water crisis, police brutality, wrongful arrests, and the suppression of students advocating for Palestine. Huwaida is currently a director of the board for many organizations, including the Palestinian American Bar Association, and she continues to educate and organize for Palestinian liberation, as well as for Arab, Muslim, and youth involvement in the American political process. Welcome and thank you, Huwaida. Our second panelist is Rabbi Alyssa Wise. Alyssa is a community organizer, educator, organizational consultant, and ritual leader with over 2 decades of movement building experience. She is the lead organizer of Rabbis for Ceasefire, which she co-founded in October of 2023, and is an ad hoc group of rabbis from across political affiliations and denominations calling for a permanent ceasefire and an arms embargo. She is co-author of Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, Lessons from Jewish Anti-Zionist Organizing. Previously, Alyssa was interim co-executive director at Jewish Voice for Peace, and prior to joining the JVP staff, she was a member, leader, and co-founder of the JVP Rabbinical Council, which since leaving JVP in 2021, she has still been serving as the Rabbinical Council's co-chair. Alyssa became a rabbi in 2009 at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and spent her summers during rabbinical school documenting human rights abuses by Israeli military and settlers with the International Women's Peace Service in the West Bank. Welcome and thank you, Alyssa. We'll begin with our prepared questions. The first question is for Hueda. This is a very, very big and heavy question. With the recent reports of increased deportations of student activists and international activists, what strategies do you believe are most effective in safeguarding civil liberties, particularly freedom of speech and assembly, within this current political climate?
Yep, thank you for that question, and thank you so much for all of the hosting, co-hosting organizations, and for everyone for being here. This is an important question. I think so many of us are horrified. A number of us are scared for ourselves, for our families, for our future, for our neighbors. And I think that the situation that we find ourselves in requires a multi-pronged strategy. And um, I'll just name some of them, but we can also discuss some of these things maybe in the Q&A part. What I think we've seen is in response to what is happening is a rapid response on different levels. And some of these are local and some of these are national. I have been on calls almost every single day with rather activist groups or legal groups. And so we need to have a legal defense. And we have organizations that are establishing these legal defense networks to provide immediate assistance to those targeted for deportation or repression. And this is largely pro bono. So it includes pro bono services. Um, there are legal hotlines. There are connections being made with immigration attorneys who specialize in political persecution, asylum, and deportation defense. I myself, for example, am not an immigration attorney, but we are networking with immigration attorneys and people and attorneys who specialize in other areas in order to be able to provide kind of this comprehensive, rapid response and defense, and maybe even be able to go on the offense. Um, and if we just look at Mahmoud Khalil, the legal team that quickly assembled around him, we have some of the best, from the ACLU to big law firms to the Clear Project to the Center for Constitutional Rights, all of these organizations that really specialize in fighting for our civil liberties, because we recognize what a huge threat what the government is doing to suppress speech, what a huge threat it is to our civil liberties, and how Palestinians are, as we always say, really like the canary in the coal mine. It's going to be, it's, uh, the administration is so sure that we have become so dehumanized that they can do this to us and it won't have a big effect. But what is, I think, heartening is the extent of the realization that it is happening to us first, but it is going to be used also as a model to attack other communities. So definitely the legal aspect. And then we have to continue and we have to ramp up the political and policy advocacy. So we need to be, and I think many of you probably are, advocating for stronger protections for students and activists, for those on visas, for this includes calling your member of Congress, even your local um, elected representatives, because these protections and the voices speaking up for these protections have to be on all levels of government, from your local school board and what are we doing at our local schools to protect our students, to your state representative and your congressional representatives. We have to ramp up, keep up, and ramp up the political pressure campaigns. And we have seen that mobilizations on all of these levels that are focusing and highlighting what's happening to those students and other activists whose names we know, but also making sure that we know that it is happening to so many more whose names we don't know, yet. And this is all tied together. It is all part of an effort to silence the movement for Palestine specifically, but it is much broader than that. And it is something that concerns all of us. And that goes into like the movement and the community organizing, how much we make sure to emphasize that this is something that affects all of us inherently. I think it is an opportunity to show just how much repression is being used uh, to silence activists, to silence the truth on Palestine and its repression on all different levels. But specifically with this administration, it is going to extend way beyond Palestine. And I'll just end with saying, and again, I would be happy to discuss this more, while we are seeing a ramping up with this administration of the attacks on our civil liberties, and it is going to extend way beyond Palestine, it is unfortunately the previous administration and administrations but before that also that laid the groundwork for what we are seeing now. Um, Certainly the attack on students, the attack on those who speak up, whether on their, their livelihoods, their jobs, their academic placements. There was an attack on that even before the Trump administration came into power. And so recognizing that, yes, we have something horrific and escalated that we have to fight now, but it also isn't new. And previous administration and the dehumanization of Palestinians and the relegation really of human rights to the back burner really of everything that is of policies that we have been pursuing has really laid the groundwork for the perilous situation that we're in now. So just to wrap up, I think we have to ramp up. We cannot in any way feel, believe, um, advocate or understand that silence is going to protect us in any way. Silence is not going to protect us. This is the moment, if any other time, that it is as important as ever to speak up and understand that our collaborative voices is what is going to save us individually and as a community and our future. So let me just end there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hoeda. And it sounds like a dream to me to think of all of these people who know the law, you and all the other attorneys coming together, working together to help protect the people who are trying to be silenced. That is such a good thing to hear. Thank you so much, Hoeda.
I'll take the next question, and it's for you, Alyssa or Rabbi Wise. I think we were together in 2009. Did you go to Birthright Unplugged? Were you on one of those tours? Yes,
I was working with the International Women's Peace Service, and so I did some support for Birthright Unplugged during those years. Yeah.
so I think we were together on one of those trips. Well, nice to see you and that you're still working on this. While acknowledging the continued importance of activism, protest, and dissent, what additional key steps encompassing electoral reform, grassroots organizing, media engagement, and legal challenges are necessary to fundamentally restructure our political system and ensure that taxpayer funds are no longer used to support policies viewed as perpetuating oppression, really to support genocide, both in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere. So this is looking at, what beyond these, what's the restructuring question? How do we restructure so we're not here again in the future?
Yeah, it's a big question and an important question. I feel like kind of ill-equipped to answer it, but I feel I'll give it my best shot. And like part of the reason I feel ill-equipped is not some kind of false modesty, but just because I feel like we are in unprecedented times and there's a limit to how much what we've tried in the past and what we understand about what has worked is going to work in this moment, right? And so I think that's kind of like my meta comment, right? Is that we need to kind of be willing to rethink the playbook, right? Like that's what our adversaries are doing. And so we need to actually do the same, right? The status quo, conventional wisdom is no longer working. And we knew this even before the Trump administration came into power, right? Under the Biden administration, where there was unprecedented support for arms embargo, ceasefire, right? That amongst the Democratic base, right? The Democratic Party didn't take up um, those policies, right? And they actively silence them, right? So the status quo of logic, right, of how you bend the powerful, right, kind of hasn't been working for a while now. And now we're even in this more intensely repressive environment. And so I think I just want to acknowledge that I think it is both scary, right? I don't know about you, but I feel fearful, right? And so I think we need to understand how unsettling for our nervous systems it is, right? And how it can make us go into fight or flight, right? Like the kind of like intense, like emotional, psychological responses we have to this time, and not minimize the impact. Because I think a lot of the repression that we're seeing is designed to kind of scare us into submission, right? So I think we actually have to be attentive to the ways in which that's subconsciously or very consciously working, right? And so we have to acknowledge the fear. And then we also have to acknowledge like what we've done so far hasn't worked, right? And so there's a level of humility, right, that we need to bring to it in order to be able to say, there has been a lot that we have accomplished, and we didn't do enough to stave off this authoritarian takeover that's happening and the kind of embrace of genocide and ethnic cleansing that's happening from our government. So, right, we have to kind of I think, have a sober assessment, right, of where we are. And then from there, go into kind of really thinking about what is it we can do. And I think the most important thing for us to know is that we don't know what it's going to take, right? We can learn from other places. I think it's really important that we do that we look to other countries who have been in similar predicaments, right? And strategies have they used, right? I think in general, the US has a problem. All of us have a problem of kind of like thinking about that all of the knowledge and all of the wisdom that exists here in the United States. And we need to challenge ourselves on that. So I think a really big piece of what we can and should be doing is coordination and relationship building and learning from international allies. I think this is important on a number of different fronts. One, because there's wisdom to learn from ways that popular movements around the world have toppled autocratic leaders, right? And that we can learn from them. I also think in the situation of Palestine, it's nothing that we want is going to come from the US-Israel alliance, right? The only way that there's going to be any kind of hope for freedom, a life of freedom and dignity and safety for Palestinians is going to come from the international community banding together and refusing the US-Israel alliance and the vision that they have of ethnic cleansing for Palestine. So I think on that level, it's also really important for us to kind of understand what's happening on the international scale, right? There's been various different kind of projects and initiatives that have started, right? There's the Hind Rajab Foundation is one. The Hague Group is another that has come together to kind of bolster international law and to enforce international law. And I think just in general, there are ways in which if we're able to build alliance internationally, we could build enough pressure to not, there is a limit, right? To what the US and Israel can get away with. It doesn't seem like it, but there actually is, because they're actually cumulatively, right? And other countries and governments in the world, there could be enough power, right? Seeing like from the Hague Group, especially like the coordination of the global South, and also looking at the Arab states plan and what the Arab states are doing and coordinating, figuring out how we can support alternative visions, right? And alternative power structures. And again, I think we're kind of starting on the back foot with that, because that's not our strength in the US of doing that. And I think figuring out how to build those international alliances and kind of get out of our US bubble is a really important strategy to try. I think at the same time that we're like looking abroad and building those alliances, it's actually really important to be organizing hyper locally, right? And I think rapid response networks and local communities are going to be really important, both for mass mobilization in case of a constitutional crisis, right, here in the US, but also as community defense, to protect those targeted by repression. That's something that I'm not going to be able to talk about it super freely on this call because of the state that we're working in, but just to say that Rabbis for Ceasefire is working on that in particular, and how do we step up being able to provide support and sanctuary, right, for activists who are under threat because of their Palestine solidarity activism, and for Palestinians who are organizing for their people's freedom. What can we do to support people on the local level? And I think a lot of you probably have been involved already in that kind of thing, but I think this is a time to really invest in those community defense networks. And that can do a combination of things, right? As both being able to actually protect vulnerable people, and but also like building those relationships of trust, right? When you think about, like, for example, doomsday prepping, right? There's three different buckets, right, that you want to think about. You want to think about relationships, skills, and gear, right? And I think for us on the left, and those of us who kind of want to be building new ways of living and relying on each other, really thinking about relationships as the top priority thing that is actually going to keep us safe, right? Knowing your neighbors, having strong relationships with your local elected officials and leaders in your community. Because I think those things are really important for rapid response, but also for inoculation, for the chilling effect of the repression to take effect. So one of the things that these local communities can be doing is to be going around and like bolstering leadership to refuse to enact, right, the repressive policies that are being demanded of them by the Trump administration. That's such an important thing right now, in particular, is to like help organizations take the risks that they need to take and take the stands they need to take, and know that there's a community behind them that's going to have their backs, right? That's actually going to be a really important strategy. And I think that bigger picture, the last thing I'll say, there's a lot more we could say. So if you want to dig into it in the Q&A, I have more concrete thoughts on this, but I think that the last thing to say is that we actually need to be thinking about infrastructure building, right? I think we don't have the level of infrastructure that we need in order to meet this moment, right? I've really been feeling like how unprepared kind of as a country we are for this kind of moment. And, we're going to need to be able to kind of create new kinds of democratic frameworks, right, that prevents a future authoritarian capture, right? And investing in building the kind of institutions and infrastructure that will make that possible, right? So I'm thinking about ways in which we can encourage like alternatives to the two-party system, right? Like the Working Families Party, for example, is an example of a kind of political party that's emerging, that's trying to put out a different vision of what we have been working with, given what a severe disappointment is an understatement to say by the Democratic Party. But also, how are we bolstering unions and other community institutions to like be there, right? To do the thing that they have long been able to have historically been able to do, and really show up in moments like these to mobilize a mass base. And I think the most important thing that we need to be doing is thinking about growing our base of people who are with us, right? In organizing, we call this base building, right? And base building is kind of the kind of floor of like, when we think about it, we need to build the level of people, the number of people that are with us and kind of share our vision, right? Both on liberation for Palestinians, which, as Hueda was saying, right, is the canary in the coal mine, right? And because doing that work is going to ensure that we're prepared for whatever the next repressive strategies are. And we need to think about building at not just like doubling the size of our movement. I think we need to grow by like 100 times, 500 times, right? We really need.
These are amazing ideas, and I think it would be amazing for us to capture some of these during the Q&A,
Yeah,
or
right.
just get a mind meld with you and Huwaida and take all of your ideas and pass them out to everyone. But I mean, again, that is an incredibly hopeful message, that if we just band together and strengthen our communities, we will have a chance to react. That's beautiful and very hopeful. And thank you for that.
Yeah, I just want to ask, could you, for those who don't know, could you say what the Hague Group is? I meant to interject there, explain that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert in the Hague Group. I've just been reading a little bit about them, but it's a group of nations, I think primarily from the global south, right, that have come together. That has come together kind of uphold the rulings of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. And it's going to take them some time to be able to build enough power to be able to do that, but that's who they are. It's a relatively new group, I think, just since the past couple of months.
Great. Thank you so much for that clarification.
Thank you. And Huwaida, the next question is for you. And I actually have difficulty asking the question in the way that it's written. I'm going to give it a try, Huwaida. So we have the recent collapse of the Israel-Gaza ceasefire. That's the part that's difficult for me to say, like a collapse. It's so sanitized. It sounds so much like, two parties mutually decided that it's not working for them. And I have great difficulty saying it like that. But the ceasefire has collapsed. And so the question is, in your opinion, how should the movement shift its focus right now, given that it did collapse? Should we be focusing more on immediate humanitarian goals and immediate humanitarian relief for the people of Gaza? Or should we still be trying to focus on long-term structural changes? What is your opinion on that? Or do we need to keep trying to do both?
Yeah. So let me, as difficult as it is for you to state the question, I think it's going to be somewhat difficult for me to answer, though I do have some thoughts on it. Before that, I just want to apologize if anyone's looking at the screen and seeing me bobbing all over the place, because I am in a car. So I do apologize if I'm making anyone dizzy. Let me start answering your question by repeating something that I frequently said, as when it comes to specifically Palestinians and our role here in the United States, or the Arab American community in the United States, and then the movement at large, because we have, for all of the decades, I think, that we have been in the US, we have not amassed the political power to have been able to stop this genocide from happening. And it's not because we haven't been focused on justice for Palestine or helping Palestinians or anything like that, but because we have focused so much on humanitarian aid and constantly putting band-aids really on all of the wounds that Israel has been repeatedly and systematically imposing on Palestinians. And that is not a criticism, because it is needed. The very survival of Palestinians in Palestine has really depended on the Palestinians and the movement for Palestinian rights abroad being able to help sustain Palestinian Sumud, what we call, I'm sorry that my car is just beeping, I really apologize, but to support this movement, or support the Sumud of Palestinians in Palestine, because Israel has been trying to get rid of us for decades. And without this support, the humanitarian support of people all over the world, I don't know if we would have been able to survive this long. At the same time, we have to recognize that we do have to invest and focus on changing the political realities that leave Palestinians in this dire situation, where it really is a matter of life and death right now. And that the situation that we are in is that we have been witnessing a live stream genocide. And despite the movement of millions and billions of people, the outrage and the movement in the streets, we have not been able to change the political realities. We have not been able to move the political actors that need to be moved in order to stop Israel. And so we have to keep focusing on that. This is not to say don't do the humanitarian. Of course, I think most people listening here know that Israel, for now, 22 days, I think, has not let one humanitarian aid truck into Palestine, and the UN says it only has a few days of flour left. It is dire, and I fully believe that Israel will allow it to go to the absolute brink before it lets some humanitarian aid trickle in. So we do have to keep up the pressure there. We do have to, I think, donate what we can to the organizations that are. There are a lot of mutual aid efforts that are happening. For example, one that I'm involved in is being supported or organized between water protectors here in the United States, indigenous communities, and Palestinians in the north of Gaza and mainly been fundraising in order to enable them to get water trucks to different communities. And so there are these mutual aid initiatives. If people can devote some resources to supporting those, I think it's extra helpful. But we have to then, like I said before, ramp up our efforts on shifting political power and raising our voices. And so one of the things, the many years that I worked in the occupied Palestinian territories, part of what I would do with the international solidarity movement and even leading some delegations is bring internationals from all over the world to see what was happening with their own eyes in Palestine. And as grateful as Palestinians were and continue to be for that solidarity and for people leaving the comforts of their own home to go to Palestine, without fail, every single person would say, thank you for being here, but your work starts when you go back to your own home countries. Like, please go back to your countries and work on changing the policies in your countries, because that is what's ultimately going to help us liberate ourselves, because Israel cannot do what it's doing, right, without the support of all of these Western countries led by the United States. So we have to escalate the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, targeting like U.S. military contractors, arms shipments, corporate complicity, supporting the student movement at their universities, demanding that their universities divest. So, and that is something that we can do really at a hyper local level. What products are our supermarkets carrying, and what kind of education campaigns can we do around there? What can we do with our educational institutions, with our schools, with our unions? So that is one thing, escalating the BDS movement. I think we have to continue to challenge U.S. military aid and weapons transfers. And there are legal challenges, certainly. I am involved in a couple of them. Unfortunately, we know, and we don't have to go into, but the attempts kind of internationally to challenge those using the International Court of Justice, the ICC, etc. Domestically, there are a few lawsuits out there and other legal initiatives, but shamefully, the U.S. courts have, and it's not new, it's really for decades that they have been saying that they are not going to get involved in, or it's not the place of the courts to get involved in lawsuits that have to do with what they call a political question. When it has to do with foreign policy, that is strictly in the purview of the executive. And so sitting in judgment of that would violate the separation of powers, etc. It's really a ridiculous argument when you actually look at the claims that are being made, which include U.S. is violating U.S. law, the U.S. is violating an international law, and there has to be some kind of legal recourse that victims have to stop the United States. But with the last decision of, if some of you followed the case of DCI Palestine, Defense for Children International Palestine versus Biden, Blinken, and Austin, the claim being made there was that the U.S. is violating U.S. law, the U.S. is violating international law, the U.S. is essentially aiding and abetting and facilitating a genocide. And there were some amicus briefs filed from international law scholars and organizations around the world saying that if U.S. courts fail to hold the United States accountable, you are essentially saying that the United States is allowed to commit genocide anywhere in the world, and there's nothing stop. There's nowhere and nobody that will be able to stop the United States. And sadly, in the most what's considered the most liberal circuit, the Ninth Circuit in the United States, the court said, nope, it's a political question. We can't sit in judgment. So it is a rough judicial landscape, legal landscape in the United States, but lawyers are still fighting, and there are a couple of lawsuits still out there trying to use different tactics and different arguments to stop the flow of U.S. aid. And of course, there are the congressional initiatives. Bernie Sanders is, again, going to introduce another resolution to stop the flow of aid to Israel, and we need to have our voices heard. They need to hear from us, because we know that, and I'm on a few mailing lists of some of these Zionist groups, and every day I'm getting something from them. Bernie Sanders is getting ready to do this. Call your Congress people. So you can bet they're hearing from the other side. Don't let our Congress people only hear from the other side. So let's ramp that up. And of course, underlying all of this is what I think we need to continue doing every day, and which we can all do in some way. There are different levels that we can do it on, but it is the educational component, because we know that here in the United States for decades, we have been basically flooded with a message that's put across in a certain way. So many people don't know the essence of what's happening. It's either too complicated or Israel is defending itself. And we can do these marches, we can do these teach-ins, but we can also talk to our neighbors and our coworkers and our friends and make sure that we are doing the education on that level. And let me just end with, again, because there's always so much to say and I want to be conscious of how much time I'm taking up, but we have to be, I think, clear about our messaging, because part of the misinformation for so long, including with the Oslo period, when we were talking starting in 1993 about a peace process and two states living side by side, etc. We not indeliberately obfuscated what is really at the heart of the matter, which is that we are dealing with an ideology that founded and that continues to carry on a settler colonial project. And so there is no negotiating with that. That's not to say that you can't negotiate what a future will look like, but you have to focus on what is the problem. And the problem is settler colonial ideology and project right now in a state that is intent on replacing the indigenous people there, right? And if we look at, even when you say the breakdown of the ceasefire, because Israel's leaders are not interested, right, in anything that could bring us to talking about actually having peace, because the idea is to get Palestinians out. And if we don't address that, the fundamental problem, the settler colonialism, the replacement ideology, the supremacist ideology, and insist that we have to dismantle that, we're just going to keep going. We're going to keep going in circles, because there is no negotiating with an entity that wants to get rid of you, right? So I think the education part can't be just about how do we negotiate with Israel to have a two-state solution. That the education part has to be about understanding the crux of the problem here and starting to dismantle it, rejecting the political program of ideology, rejecting supremacy, rejecting colonialism. And when you tear that down, then you have people kind of understand, even though all of the misunderstanding that comes around what the Palestinian resistance is and what Palestinians should do is all built on this lies that have been put forth to people for decades. And so when we continue our education, I just want to urge people to make sure that it is in the correct framework, so that we are not misleading, and then we give people an easy out to be able to say, oh, it's a decade long, they just don't want to agree, or it's a religious conflict, or any of that. So the education part has to be grounded in a firm understanding of what the root cause of the problem is here. So again, as with, I think, answers to all of a multi-pronged approach, definitely continuing to highlight the crimes that Israel committing, documenting them, exposing them. Wherever you are, there is something that we can do, each one of us, every single day. Let's make sure to work on the political, but pushing on the humanitarian, because it is so dire. It is every day a matter of life and death. I think we can do both.
Yes, thank you, Haweda. It reminds me that as painful as the time is, the starkness is a revelation. You're either for settler colonialism and the expulsion of a people, or you're not. And so I think as hard as the times are, they're revealing. But I'd like to turn to Alyssa and look at anti-Semitism to mute knowledge of so this knowledge that Haweda said we have to correct and inform. With heightened security and accusation of anti-Semitism, defense of Palestinians is considered anti-Semitic, or extremism, you get that accusation. Defense of Palestinians, you're defending terrorism if you speak up for Palestinian determination. How can the movement shape its message to reach a broader audience? That's kind of been, as Haweda said so well, that, has been the conflict is obfuscated with these claims. But I want to add one more detail to that question. How can that message be articulated when people who are speaking up are facing doxing, facing, surveillance, facing very invasive tactics made possible by technology? So I hope that's clear.
Yeah, there's a lot in that question, actually.
Yeah. And I'll give you good speakers if we're going to be a little aggressive just to make sure we get, a couple more questions. And so I'll give you, if I jump in, that we'll take up this in the Q&A later. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, to start about, I mean, there's one piece about the way that the question was framed that I kind of want to unpack for a second, right? So on the one hand, the question is like accusations of anti-Semitism, where people say defense of Palestinians is anti-Semitic, and then you said extremism or defense of Palestinians is defending terrorism. But I actually would say that part of what we have at play here is kind of projects that have been funded to the tune of many millions of dollars, right? To both liken critique of Israel with anti-Semitism and to liken terrorism with Islam and with Palestinians in particular. So there's like three different systems of oppression that are kind of at play in this conversation. There's anti-Semitism, there's Islamophobia, and there's anti-Palestinian racism, which I think is a form of oppression that hasn't actually doesn't actually get talked about enough, right? It gets lumped into Islamophobia. But first of all, not all Palestinians are Muslim. And second of all, there's a discrete way in which anti-Palestinian racism kind of takes root. So I kind of want to look at those briefly. And so to start with anti-Semitism, right? The issue is that we have the reality that there is such a thing, right, as anti-Semitism, and there has been, and there continues to be, right, of people who hate Jews for being Jews, right, and that leads to violence and oppression and in so many myriad ways. Now, that's not the same thing, right, as what many want us to believe, which is that critiquing Israel is anti-Semitic. So there's a couple rules of thumb, right, that I like to use in thinking about that. One is, for those of you who are not Jewish, and I know this because I am, for example, I'm lots of things, but for example, I'm a white person who aspires to be anti-racist, but I also understand that I have grown up in a society that's deeply racist. So even if I say I'm anti-racist, I know that it's likely that I could still that I still harbor racist ideas from the ways that it's been inculcated in me. So what I do around that is like I have to have an ongoing practice of interrogating my own racism and practices that help me unlearn those ideas. And I think the same is incumbent upon people who aren't Jewish to kind of interrogate your own anti-Semitism, right? It's not inherently anti-Semitic to critique Israel. That doesn't mean that you're not anti-Semitic, right? When somebody asks me what to say about being charged with anti-Semitism, I would say like, well, are you, right? Like just because you're critiquing Israel or defending Palestinians doesn't mean you are, but that doesn't mean that you don't harbor some other set of beliefs. And I actually think the false charges of anti-Semitism that are used to silence critics of Israel are actually have more weight when you haven't done your own interrogation, because you're more susceptible to kind of being to cower into silence if you don't have kind of a rigor, right, about that. I think that, I want to say a word about anti-Palestinian racism as distinct from Islamophobia. I think we all know, particularly since September 11th, kind of like there's been like an Islamophobia industry, kind of similar to the critique of Israel's anti-Semitic industry, right? That is kind of wanting us to associate all Arabs with all Muslims, right? And to link them with terrorism, right? And we're actually seeing like that's actually what the Trump administration is using now, right? And in this moment, right, of kind of bringing terrorism charges against student activists, right? And I think that part of the way that that works is that there is a dynamic of anti-Palestinian racism that doesn't actually we haven't brought that into colloquial use, right? So we're not used to being able to point to it, right? Where people are justifying violence against Palestinians. They fail to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people. They are willing to erase the human dignity of Palestinians and defame and exclude Palestinians and those who advocate for Palestinians. And I think that's actually a really dangerous, because that goes unchecked. Like even a society where people are sensitive to kind of anti-Black racism or even Islamophobia, the stuff that people get away with about Palestinians is criminal, right? And it just kind of, we don't challenge it in that same way. And I think we need to actually be more rigorous about that. And I think in this moment, one of the things that we can do is when there are a lot of people who say are like in the center, right? A lot of people are really fearful of and hate what the Trump administration is doing. So being able to point to Trumpism kind of and liken these kinds of strategies with Trumpism is a way to pull people away from them, right? But I also think that there's and that's actually a really important rhetorical strategy. And then I think that this is the piece where growing our movement is really important, because it does get scary when you were saying about people getting doxxed, right? And the kind of attacks that we have. I think on the one hand, there's a lot that we can do to make our digital lives more secure. And I think we all should take up doing that. There's a lot of really good resources out there, which I can help connect you to so you could feel more powerful and more safe in being part of digital activism. And I also think that there is, that it's a cliche, but it's also true that there's safety in numbers, right? And that it is hard to feel like you're the lone voice, and it's a lot easier when you're not, right? And so growing the organizing that we're doing, the base building to get there to be more people who are with us, right? And so that includes having conversations like these in your local community and figuring out who could you bring together in your living room for a conversation around this. And it's through those kinds of organizing that we can actually grow our courage, because it's easy to pick off one person at a time if there isn't, right, a whole movement of people behind them. And so I think that's actually a really important strategy to making sure that we can continue to act in the ways that we need to in this moment.
Thank you. I think that is a very critical point to remind us about anti-Palestinian racism. It is not a term that we hear enough. And interestingly, even many Trump supporters do not want to be perceived as racist. And to be challenged in a specific term, I think is helpful. It's helpful, and I appreciate you giving us that term and inviting us to interrogate our own anti-Semitism as well. I'm wondering, Roxanne, it is 2:20. Do we want to open it up to the Q&A and allow our audience to ask Huwaida and Alyssa some questions, or?
I think that would be a wonderful idea. I think some of these questions will come up again in Q&A, and that's a wonderful idea to move to the Q&A. Right, just before we get to the Q&A, I just want to quickly summarize and say that so far, Huwaida and Alyssa, you have given me tremendous hope, and you actually say things of a common theme, which are we need to be hyperlocal, start hyperlocal, network with each other, take actions, influence your government, I mean, at all the levels, and influence how you shop and where you shop, and education, get on your school's education committee, talk to your local reps, talk to your state reps, talk to your federal reps. That's a very hopeful and powerful message that as activists, we can all try to look at again. That's super hopeful, and I thank you both for that. And I will turn it over to Claire to begin the Q&A now, and I will be back a little later. Thank you.
Thanks, Roxanne. I'm going to welcome Sarwat Patel, who is a board member for the Community Alliance for Peace and Justice, the primary host for this afternoon's program, and she's going to help us curate or look through the Q&A from the audience. Audience, I invite you, or all of us who are hosting, invite you, if you could frame your questions in, this is a practical kind of workshopping. We're thinking out loud together on how to do activism for Palestinian self-determination in a very changing context, in a very challenging context. So if you could really focus your questions on practices, techniques, questions about strategy, that would be much appreciated. So having said that, I'm going to let Sarwat take the first question.
Thank you so much. First of all, I wanted to share my sheer gratitude to Huwaida and Rabbi Weiss for being part of this. And specifically, Huwaida, you apologize for being in the car. I actually thank you for being in the car and doing this and making time, because we all have been scrambling to do whatever that we can. And I know what it means to be in a position and still want to be part of it. So we really appreciate it, and we thank you for that. I was initially going to address the first question, and what we were doing is we're looking at the questions and we're trying to pool them together. There was a theme that kept coming up regarding the repression that is occurring and the fear that drives into everybody's minds and hearts, which then shuts down whatever it is that they feel they want to do. And I think there were questions by Janet and Kristen that were talking about, Julie and Kristen, which talked about, have there been any US citizens that have been targeted for writing letters because there are requests out from various organizations like Doctors Against Genocide to write to President Trump? And the fear is when you get involved at various levels, whether it is writing letters, whether it is protests, how fearful should, what that does to the fear in the hearts of many who would like to join the efforts but don't know how to proceed. And I was initially going to address that to Hueda, but Rabbi Weiss touched upon it, because you said it is really important to learn about digital security and learning how can we best position. So I'll leave it up to both of you, but maybe we can give some very specific guidelines, especially to those of us that are online today that want to do more, but just get scared with what we see happening. And how can we go about reasonably safely, but realizing the risks that are involved?
Do you want me to speak first, or?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, look, I think one important thing to say is like there's no way to guarantee complete safety, right? Like that's just the reality, right? And so we have to kind of assess our own willingness to take those risks, right? And right now it's scary, right? I don't want to minimize that, right? But I feel like there are things we can do that will help us be more secure, and I just feel like there is going to be a limit, right? So if your personal threshold is no risk, right, that is going to be silence is going to be where you have to end up. And I really want to encourage us to kind of grow our ability to take risks, because there's not really another way out. Like, people are going to have to take risks and have consequences, right? And God willing, that won't mean losing our lives, going to prison, right? Like, there's a lot of things that could happen. And I'm not saying that we need to be, cavalier and careless. But I think that, being able to do the things that will help us feel safe. And so, for example, to be concrete, right? There's a lot of stuff that you could do around how you communicate, use technology, right? That are kind of very basic, which minimize the ability for bad actors, whether the state or otherwise, to have their eyes on what you're doing. So one thing is using a VPN. I'm not going to be able to tell you what a VPN is, so you're going to have to Google it. I just know the practices that I've started to embody, but one is a VPN. That is something that you could have on your computer and your phone, which makes it difficult for people to know where you are while you're using your computer. The second is to use Signal, which is an encrypted. It's a text messaging app that you can have both on your computer and on your phone. And you just use the same phone number that you use regularly, and you could communicate securely through Signal. So those are like two first step things that I would recommend, is like downloading a VPN and starting to communicate as much as possible, in particular when you're doing things that are sensitive, meaning organizing a direct action, right? Or talking to somebody about offering them refuge in your home. For example, those are things that you would want to make sure that you're using Signal for. The other things that you can do is just basic digital security stuff that I think a lot of apps encourage you to do, like two-factor authentication. Another important thing is not using biometrics on your phone. So not using facial recognition software, in particular when you are at protests or anywhere where somebody might confiscate your phone, because they could just hold the phone up to your face and access all of your information and contacts inside your phone. So that's another thing to think about. And the other thing is you can do things that, for example, would be help you kind of get your presence off the internet, right? So there's things like Delete Me, which is a service you can use that can kind of take your private information off of the internet so people can't find, for example, where you live. And then there's these new apps that can remove that you can remove facial recognition. Like facial recognition technology is now being used more and more. We know that it's used through drones in Palestine, and it's used in the US, where people can take a picture of you and then scan it to see if you've been at a certain protest. But there's one app called PIM Eyes and another one called facecheck.id, where you can delete your photos from face check search engines so that people can't find you. So there are apps and tools that you can use, right? And I think these are all really important to do, like, because they help you feel, to the extent they make you feel more secure, but we also don't want to get into a mode of like security theater where you're doing things that make you feel that aren't actually helpful, but make you feel like you're doing something and you're not actually improving your safety. But I think the thing is to use common sense, put some of these apps and security measures into place for a modicum of more security, and then also use common sense about, you know, what you're communicating and to who via what channel, and how, you know, I kind of like take this, I have had experience of government surveillance in my history of doing this work. I was, we don't need to get into details, though it's an interesting story. But the point is, ever since that happened, I kind of just like have a thing where I don't write an email where I'm like, I don't want the state to have the contents of this email. Right. And so if I ever have a thing where I feel like I prefer for somebody not to know this, whether to protect the identity of the person I'm writing to, or because I worry that whatever it is I'm writing will trigger some search they have about me based on the words that I use, right, in my email, and then I would move that communication over to Signal. So you do have to use some common sense and not just rely on these apps. But putting those things into place are a good start. And I'm happy to send the links to what I mentioned, so that everybody can start to employ better practices.
I think that would be great. Thank you.
Have questions concerning communication with our Congress people. Pat Westwater Jong she had 2 questions. She wanted to know whether it is too early to correct the record on or give more detailed record of what happened on October 7th regarding members of Congress, not knowing and still buying a narrative that is often propagandistic and dehumanizing. And she also is asking about communicating to members of Congress for the joint resolutions of disapproval, how to get more support from them.
I can take a stab at that. I think in terms of communicating, in terms of what happened on October 7th, the fact is we don't know a lot of the details. We have had some investigative journalists, some things have definitely been disproven, and I think that we can highlight those. What is most important, I think, about the message is something that we've been saying since the very first day, is that history didn't start on October 7th. You have to recognize all of these things and it's pretty sad, because as long as I've been involved in this, I have been saying, yes, we don't want anybody to be killed. But as long as you keep ignoring the root cause of what is causing the violence, you are not helping anybody. And this is exactly what our members of Congress are doing. They think that either more politically, either they're very naive or racist, or it's just politically convenient for them to dehumanize Palestinians and just paint us as, people who are inherently violent, who don't accept, don't want to live with Jews or like that has been disproven by Palestinians over and over and over again. And as someone who has lived for a number of years in the occupied Palestinian territory, who has been to Gaza, who has seen, of course, nothing like the destruction that we're seeing now. But one thing that I almost always say is I really don't understand how it's humanly possible for Palestinians to be as generous and as loving and as insisting on life as they are, when for their whole lives they have known nothing but really evil. But being ruled by an entity that wants to get rid of them, these horrifically violent policies that dehumanize them on every single level, and the complete indifference or the support of the international community. So they have never known like really compassion from anyone. And yet you can come from the United States, the country that is bankrolling and enabling what's happening to them. You can even come as an Israeli that is not coming as an occupier, but is that coming as an equal, and go into Palestinian communities and be welcomed and be protected and be respected. So how it is humanly possible, even from just a psychological level, to do that, to maintain that humanity when you have been dehumanized for your entire life and that is all you've ever known, is really remarkable to me. And that is something that our political, representatives, our leaders, either conveniently ignore, don't know about, or are just too racist to understand that this is Palestinian reality. This is a message that Palestinians have been giving. So I think that sharing some of these stories and insisting that it didn't start on October 7th, we have to recognize the decades of oppression. You can't continue to ignore all of these human rights organizations that are putting reports out there in front of you, and because it's politically convenient for you to ignore what you're doing, is perpetuating the violence against Palestinians and Israelis, and contributing to a situation where we'll never have any kind of resolution. And that is, quite frankly, dishonest and inhumane. So I don't know if you want to, again, just to summarize, to go into saying this is what happened or this is not what happened, as much as it's important to say it didn't start, whatever you think of what happened there, it didn't start on that day. And you can't ignore everything that led us up to October 7th and what we're seeing right now. And a big part of it is the decades of impunity and protection that the United States has been providing to Israel that has led us to a day in time where we can see again this live stream genocide, and it can happen, and Israelis can brag about it, even with the latest declaration that no humanitarian aid is going to get into Gaza whatsoever. I mean, that is clearly a war crime, and in the context in which it's done, it is a crime against humanity, and they don't care. They'll announce it because they don't think that they're going to be held accountable at all, because that is what we've gotten them used to. So I think these are important messages to convey.
Claire, I think you're muted.
Thank you so much. It's very helpful to have that phrase, it didn't happen on October 7th, and that if you ignore the structural violence, you actually perpetuate the violence. And I think to go back to the phrase anti-Palestinian racism, to say that it is permissible to starve a whole community is really to participate in that. And I think to expose that is very important. I will pass to Sarwat.
Thank you so much for that, Hueda. I wanted to build on that because a couple of questions that came up was acknowledgement of the severe level of dehumanization of the Palestinians, and how does one go about changing that? And I think you touched upon it, and it's such a huge task because there's 75 years of dehumanization. It's not something that started yesterday, didn't start on October 7th, and I think you touched upon it. A lot of our elected officials actually don't want to hear. It's not necessarily a matter of lack of knowledge. So, what would you say? Some very simple, these 3 steps would not change anything, but they would be the beginning. What are 3 simple things you could say to everybody, as somebody who has seen this devastation, who comes from the indigenous people? What would you say 3 simple steps that we could take in our daily lives on an ongoing basis that could help change the narrative? Because we don't have the mainstream media, we don't have our elected officials safeguarding it, so it will be left to our actions at grassroots levels.
I'm sorry, I missed if that question was for me, but I'm going to assume that it is. Yeah. I don't know if I could break it down into 3 simple steps, but I think it's important to center Palestinian voices, right? And so many people, because of the way our media is, don't hear from Palestinians. As we know, if we turn on at least the mainstream media, it's always the Israeli narrative or Israeli kind of pundits or Zionists pundits and commentators. And we know that in the mainstream media, there is this censorship that exists. And so we have so many tools and resources and platforms these days to be able to center Palestinian voices. And I think that that is really effective, in just being able to ask someone, whether it's your elected representative or your next door neighbor, like, have you listened to a Palestinian? Have you, do you? And then, like, that is one thing. The other thing is some personal stories of, and I think this works whether you have been to Palestine, not been to Palestine, like, where did you come into this from? Why is it important to you? I think that that is one of the most kind of important ways to be able to initially connect with someone. And then an overall, I think, theme, and that we've talked about here also, is how much we connect struggles. And because in this situation, we are so used to, unfortunately, become so used to how the level to which Palestinians have been dehumanized. I honestly think some people just don't even recognize it. They'll be saying things that they don't recognize. If you put it in any other context, it would stand out to you as being awfully racist. And so that's why you have, like, progressives, except for Palestine, or people that are great on many issues, but in terms of Palestine, maybe they don't recognize the level to which they've accepted this dehumanization. So it kind of even putting it in another context to be able to have them see just how racist, kind of, or how racist they've been conditioned to be, whether it is their on purpose or not. So those aren't necessarily three simple steps, but I think three things that might work that people can try is really, with all of the platforms, like if you're organizing something locally, to be able to bring Palestinians in, connect to them. There are a lot of platforms right now, media and otherwise, that do platform Palestinian voices a lot and bring Palestinians from the Gaza and the West Bank. And you may know some of them from the Electronic Intifada and Mondo Weiss. The Institute for Middle East Understanding is really big on that. So there are resources there that can help you connect to Palestinians on the ground if you're organizing something locally, taking those stories, getting those heard, telling personal stories from yourself and why you're concerned and how you got connected. And then sometimes when it's really necessary, or when it's really obvious that there's an exceptionalism for Palestine, really point out to people how, if it was any other context, you would see the racism, but and we have to break through that. So I don't know if I answered those, but those are the first three, the question, but those are the first three things that come to mind.
No, I think you answered it beautifully. And the reason I kind of did the three things, it's almost naive of a question that I posed to you, because there is no three things that'll change the scenario. But I think there's so many people that want to do something, and sometimes if they have a few things in their mind and they begin, and then the journey takes them a lot further. So I really appreciate you doing that. Thank you.
Next question, and I'm going to bundle three, and two are focused on tactics and strategies, and one, the current climate in which we work. So we have a question concerning BDS, which the boycott divestment movement was so valuable in South Africa. It was very valuable in the struggle for Black rights here in the United States. Why is it become so difficult in challenging Zionism? That's a first tactic question. The second tactic question, coming from me, which emerged in response to supporting student activism, there is a new phrase emerging on campus of institutional neutrality. Students have spoken about their colleges are professing institutional neutrality. So how do you push back against that? Have there been any successful examples of challenging this? Where institutional neutrality seems to mean we will not interfere with any deportations, or, be out front in protecting our students. And the third question regards climate. One participant said, I've made a lot of comments on Facebook regarding, support for the people of Gaza. Am I shooting myself in the foot? And will I? Another person was worried that airport travel, would international travel, they would be compromised because of comments even that they had made regarding this, the genocide. So, lot there. Two tactic questions and one climate question. Current climate. Alyssa, do you want to take the BDS? You can start.
Sure.
Both of you can weigh in. I know that's a big one.
Yeah. I think that one of the reasons that the BDS I think the BDS campaign has actually been hugely successful, right? And it hasn't achieved exactly in the same, like it's South Africa and Israel, Palestine there's like a lot of important differences, right? Political differences. But I think that I don't want to say that it hasn't been successful because I actually think it really has and been like a really important, clear call for how the global community can show solidarity with the Palestinian people. I think there's a few key reasons why, to the extent that people perceive it as having difficulty in take up, right? One is that there's, as I was mentioning before, the like $1 million industries that have sprouted up to like in critique, or really not even critique as much as like accountability for Israel with anti-Semitism. The BDS movement has been a prime example of that. So there's efforts to, I don't know, all 30 to 40 states have laws banning different types of bans against BDS tactics. We've heard over the years of ridiculous things like people, in order to receive FEMA grants, have to sign that they won't be part of boycotting Israel, or school teachers have to say, in order to get a contract in a school district in some states, that they won't engage in BDS, right? So there's, in a huge campaign, right? That's actually international in scope, that has tried to legislate against BDS, right? That kind of activity wasn't at that level, in during the fight for freedom from apartheid in South Africa. So I think that's like a really big piece of it, right? And there's legislation that is moving at every level of the legislature here in the US and throughout Europe and other places of the world to legislate a definition of anti-Semitism that includes criticism of Israel. It's called the IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. And that's happening at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local city level. And so I think that that's a huge factor, right? I think that there's another factor that's important to name, which is one that really frustrates me, is like a too mild of a way to put it, enrages me, right? Is the way in which that actually the progressives, except for Palestine, that Hueda was talking about, it's really like the liberals, and there's the liberal and center have kind of carried water for the campaign to undermine the legitimacy of BDS, right? So even as there are liberals and centrists that say they want a two-state solution, or they want accountability for Israel, they want the occupation to end, here is a strategy that it's a time-honored social movement strategy of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And they themselves have been part of undermining its legitimacy by parroting these claims that they are anti-Semitic, right? And so I think that not only do we have the far right, and we haven't even talked today about Christian Zionism and the way that has influenced Zionism from its inception as a political movement, and animates US foreign policy today, and is part of moving these kinds of legislations, right-wing legislation to criminalize BDS. But we also have the center and the center left kind of refusing to do anything meaningful to pressure Israel to make a change, right? And I'm thinking about years ago, when I was at Jewish Voice for Peace, I used to spend a lot of time in Christian denominations, mainline denominations, as they were seeking to do targeted divestment, right, of companies profiting from the occupation specifically. And they're here, and at every church hearing where I was at, they would bring kind of liberal like liberal leaders to undermine that and tell the church that they were being anti-Semitic and that their local interfaith alliances were going to be compromised if they actually voted their consciences to divest, to make sure that their values aligned with their institutional divestment. So it's a multi-pronged strategy that we can't just put on the right. We actually also have to put on the liberals in the center.
Thank you for that. I think that summarized it well.
Did you want to add any, talk about the institutional neutrality, Huwaida? Have you heard this term? It's very recent.
Yes, and just briefly, I haven't necessarily seen where it has been overcome yet. I know the University of Michigan, I mean, I'm in Michigan, the University of Michigan board recently approved also institutional neutrality. But one of the things that the students pointed out is the University of Michigan president recently spoke at an ADL conference and was talking about how supportive of Israel he is and all of the things that he has done to actually oppose the students' call for BDS on campus. So highlighting how that violates institutional neutrality. So you're the president of a university and you're violating your own kind of policies. So you know, the university still has that in place for now. I haven't, again, seen where it has been defeated yet, but it is fairly new. I think it probably can be, but one of the things that it feeds into is this position of, or let's call it the shameful capitulation that has been exemplified by Columbia. And I think, unfortunately, other institutions are going to cave to really selling out not only their students when it comes to safety and their civil liberties and their right to speak, but the whole purpose of these and the legacy of these academic institutions that are supposed to be bastions of free speech and thought and everything that we think that higher education is supposed to be in terms of, being this center where our students and future leaders go to have their minds open and go to open their minds and connect with the world and go forth from there to help us build the better world. And when these institutions are caving, when these institutions are sacrificing our civil liberties, what does that mean? And there's going to be this tension. I think that there is it is being highlighted between, for example, if we just look at Columbia, the reports coming out from Columbia about not only the students, but certainly the faculty that is just outraged at how Columbia kind of capitulated. It's a clash between the students and faculty that believe in missions of these institutions. And then what has become, I think, more common is that who are the people on the boards of these institutions, and they have big kind of corporate interests, and it's not necessarily the interests of what these institutions are supposed to stand for, but it's more financial. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but when Professor Rashid Khalidi recently announced his resignation, in this big article, he talked about them being, universities are just really cash cows right now, and it really exemplifies this deterioration of the very foundations of these institutions. I think there's an opportunity to create enough to build on, to join the outrage of faculty and students, and use that to highlight just how much we're willing to sacrifice to, or what's being done to silence the truth on Palestine, and from there on other issues. So it's a huge attack on our civil liberties. And I really think we're at a precipice. I think we're at this moment. Just to briefly, there was this comment I didn't answer, but in terms of people participating in the threats to them, yes, there are these threats, but we need to, I think, recognize that if we don't defeat it now, do all that we can to stop it now, and it is by adding our voices, it will, the freedoms I think that we've come to take for granted will completely be eroded. I mean, if we don't win this case, Mahmoud Khalil's case, that spells disaster for a lot of things after that. And I think that's why you're seeing so much energy being put into Mahmoud Khalil's case, because what we're doing is legal, and what is happening is this blatant attack to just silence us and erode our civil liberties. So I would say it's all hands on deck. Of course, everybody makes their own decision when it comes to the risks that they're able to take. But I'm just, as a movement, as a country, we're just at a really dangerous point where we need everybody in at all levels to fight and to defeat this before we decline into total like fascism and authoritarianism. That's how, I don't mean to be alarmist, but I really think that that's kind of where we are right now.
I think, Hueda, you've said that beautifully. It's essentially what it is. The way I explain it to somebody who's not familiar, I said, well, I do nothing for Palestine. It's what Palestine has taught me and made me aware of. And I think that actually captures.
Oh, sorry. That is beautiful. That is right. But I forgot to mention, there are, as bleak as it looks in some areas, there are also, and I'm part of a lawsuit, like actually suing the University of Michigan. There was just a lawsuit by students too against UCLA. There's one against Columbia. There are lawsuits, proactive lawsuits being launched really around the country against these institutions for violating the constitutional rights of these students. So maybe we don't hear about those as much, but they are happening. And I think that we, as much as we can, to kind of join and support them in the ways that we can is important. So things are being fought at every level. We're under a barrage of attacks, but we are fighting back. We are fighting back at all levels. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I wanted to mention that we are proactively suing the University of Michigan here, and there are other similar lawsuits around the country for the same.
I think that's really, I'm glad you shared that, because I think it's a reminder that it's going to trickle up from every corner. And that should be reassuring to us at so many different levels. I will state the final question for the webinar. I'll address it to Hueda, but please, Rabbi Weiss, feel free to add to it as you see fit. Congress legislative focus activity has always leaned heavily towards bolstering Israeli military power and giving them a diplomatic cover. We've had bills like House Resolution 1229, 867 that reflect these priorities. And even though there are efforts that support Palestine, like the JRD, we know that they face very long odds purely because of where our elected officials lean. So the question is that, given this reality, do you think it would be more effective trying to affect change at the state legislature efforts? Because that is when we can go to our representatives that we should be meeting at events and really calling them out or asking them or sharing our concerns about oppression of free speech, about the allegations of conflating or the conflating of anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, and then pushing things, even though they're symbolic, ceasefire resolutions.
I just saw that Rabbi Alyssa has to hop off in a couple minutes. So did you want to say anything to that before you have to hop off?
I don't think that I think that this is your wheelhouse, honestly.
Look, I think it's all connected in a way. And I can give an example of when we talk about foreign policy and the money that's being sent to Israel and all of that stuff, it is at a federal level, but a lot of it comes back kind of locally, and how much are we asserting our power and having our voices heard. And if I'm going to give like a brief example of, I think, what we're doing in Michigan, this past summer, the students who led the University of Michigan encampments decided to use their mobilization and take that energy and turn it into electoral organizing, and ran a candidate. I was honored to be me, but to try to get me on the University of Michigan Board of Regents, because in Michigan, that's elected. It's not an appointed position. Even though I did not really want to be a regent, I really wanted to support them, and I thought it was important. And we ran it. We had like less than 3 weeks, but they mobilized like phenomenally. And when we showed up at the convention where they were going to elect the Democratic nominee, like the students overwhelmed the convention. I mean, we're more than half of these traditional Democrats, and they were shocked. But we do believe that the Michigan Democratic Party cheated us out of that nomination, which there's also another lawsuit about. But what's important there is that a lot of regular longtime Democrats recognize that something was not right, and all of these young people came who we traditionally say we want in our party, and we like turn them away. Something's not right. And when we recently had elections for Michigan Democratic Party, just last month, it was for the leader of the Michigan Democratic Party in Michigan. The candidates running for that position came to the students and came to our group to be like, how do we get your support? Because we showed up in mass. So showing up is really important. And though the Michigan Democratic Party doesn't make policy, doesn't affect foreign policy or anything like that, when our local elected or our state electeds are seeing that we are showing up and we care and we're following them and we are actually coming out in power and we can mobilize up. And so I think that is very important. And right now there are a number of initiatives also to take that to force our local and our state reps to sign on to things that that Democratic Party, and this can be done. I'm talking about Democratic Party because that's where I have been active, even though I fully agree we need like a third party and a fourth party. And if those people on this call, if anyone's active with the Republican or any other party, do that there, mobilize with people to make sure that they hear your voice, because then you become somebody that they need in order to win. So it's not maybe a direct answer to this question, but it was all about showing up. And when we organize and show up, because a lot of us think, and a lot of young people, I think that there's no political home for them and our voices aren't heard anyway, and it doesn't matter. And so we focus on the movement in the streets, but it's important to recognize that the movement in the streets goes hand in hand with the movements in the courtrooms, goes hand in hand with what we're doing and who we're electing. And until we change the system, we push to change it, but until then we show up wherever we can and make sure that they know that we are a force to be reckoned with. And local moves up to state is reflected too, I think, in the national, and that is part of how we make change.
Thank you so very much, Huwaida, and thank you so very much, Alyssa. It's very sad that we've come to the end of our time, but I think I can speak for everybody in saying you've given us hope. These are very hopeful messages that we are powerful and we must come together and do all of the small actions every day that will add up to great change. And that's a really inspiring and hopeful message. And we really appreciate everyone joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One last thing really quick, because I saw someone mention AFSC in the comments, and there is I think it's something different groups can be a part of, is taking the Apartheid Free Communities Pledge. And there have recently been some victories there. Some of your listeners might have heard that Vermont, I think it was Vermont that mentioned it managed to get a number of their communities actually pass a resolution declaring themselves to be apartheid-free communities. And that's again, local mobilization. It can even be taken up, a much bigger effort, but on the state level, can we get our local cities or townships or even states to, through this kind of organizing, to agree to be apartheid-free communities? So I think if people want to have a look at their website and that initiative and sign on, I think that's also another
a wonderful suggestion. And just a quick note, we will send out a recording of this webinar to everyone who attended. And we've had multiple requests to also send the chat, because people really want to connect. And we all believe the more we connect, the louder our voice will be and the more power we will have to affect change. So we will be doing that. And thank you all very much again for making time on a weekend to be here.
Thank you so much. Lots of really terrific ideas, and I too found it a very hopeful discussion. Thank you. I think there is a lot going on.